Hi, this is Robin, and this is part 2 of my artistic blur effects in Photoshop set. In this video, I'm going to cover selective focus. So in other words, creating a sweet spot of sharpness that is surrounded by a very soft blur. The look I'm going for is a lens baby, lens-like look. So hopefully that will be of interest to you, and especially if you do close-ups and macro shots, this might be an effect that you'd like to learn how to use. The tool that I'm going to use to show you how to achieve this is the iris blur in Photoshop. Now, in part 1 of this set of videos on artistic blur, I had covered overall background blur. And in that video, I mentioned a number of different benefits to using blur in your images. I'm not going to repeat that here, just so if you want to hear some of the benefits to know what to think about for your own images, I recommend that you check out that background blur video. But the one benefit that I think is particularly relevant for this whole idea of a shallow focus or selective focus is that blur can help remove or minimize distractions in a scene. So sometimes too much detail is not a good thing in photography. So for instance, in this image that I'm going to use for the demo today, there's an awful lot going on here between whatever's on the plate, what's behind the plate, etc. So I think sometimes if we can just keep the focus on the main things in the scene by having that sweet spot area of focus and then soften and blur what's around it as a distraction, that's what this iris blur tool is intended to do, and that's what I'm going to demonstrate and show you how to achieve with your images. Now, besides the fact that I think it can make something like food photography look very artistic to use this selective focus, there are other types of images that it would be good for as well. And as I said right up front, close-ups and macro shots I think are ideal for this type of a blur. Now, if you're shooting insects, for instance, or jewelry, or flowers and plants, by using a sweet spot of sharpness and then surrounded by some pretty soft blur, you can keep the attention right on your main objects in the scene and what you want to be the stars of your photograph. So let's get started with the demo, and I will show you how to work with the iris blur in Photoshop. So first of all, just a quick tour of my interface since I've customized it. My layers panel is up at the top. My properties panel is down here at the bottom, and I have docked my toolbar right so that everything is close together and easy to use. So once you open your image, I always suggest that you duplicate it and work on a copy. So you can either do Control or Command J to jump that up to a new layer, or left click, drag it to the bottom of the layers panel to the new layer icon right down there, and that creates a background layer. In addition to creating that background layer, the next thing you have to do before you work with blur is convert this duplicated layer to a smart object. And the reason you want to work with a smart object is that the blur tools in Photoshop are destructive. And what I mean by that is once you've made the changes, it alters your image. You can't just go back. You can't make revisions to it easily. You just have to start over. And especially if you did something to your original layer, your image is going to be overwritten by the blur effect. So by converting to the layer to a smart object, you make it safe not only to be able to recover that image, but you give yourself the flexibility to go back in and make revisions if you change your mind about the level of effect that you have used. So in order to convert this layer to a smart object, come over to the blank area of the layer, right click, and come down to where it says Convert to Smart Object and left click on that. And now this layer and this thumbnail is a smart object. It has that little icon in the lower right that lets you know it's a smart object, and you can see this one doesn't have it, so it's not a smart object. Now, with this layer active that's now a smart object, we'll go to the top of the interface to the filter menu, come down to blur gallery, so not blur, but blur gallery. come across to the flyout, and we're going to work with iris blur. So when that's highlighted, click that, and it puts you into the blur gallery interface. So you can see it's different than the usual layers over there on the right. Now let me just give you a little bit of a tour of what's going on here. So you can see all of the different blur gallery features are here, but it has expanded iris blur, which is what we're working with for us to work with on this image. And you have this blur slider here. So the further you pull this to the right, the more blurred your image will become. The further to the left, the less blurred it will be. So we'll leave that there for now, and just so that you're aware of it, okay? Now it also has set this bounding box with a pink line right centered in your image. So what you want to do is get that box into the area of your image that you want to have in focus. And the way you will do that is to use this pin right in the center here. So there's that little white circle with a pink dot in it. That's the pin. And so what you want to do is drag and drop that onto the object or objects in your image that you want to be sharp and in focus. So for my case, what I want is basically to end up with this steak and some of the herbs on top of it in focus, a little bit of the knife that's coming into it, and then just a small portion of the vegetables that are adjacent to it in the foreground here in focus. So let's see how we can achieve that. So again, I'm going to click on this center focus point and drag it down to where I want it. So here I want it on the steak. Now there's this little swooping arc here, and what this is basically a dial. So if you left click on that, you can pull it up, and if you watch the image, it's getting more or less sharp as you adjust that dial. So what that dial that surrounds the center focus point is doing is the same thing as this blur slider over here. So you can use either one, whatever's more convenient. This is sort of nice, so you don't have to keep going up and down. You're just working here on the image. So you can adjust the blur to taste for your image. All right, so we've got the focal point that the sharpness is being built around. Then the next tier out is this inner circle of white small circles here. So we have 4 of them. And what this is doing is creating a transition point, or a transition range, I guess is another way to describe it, between the sharpness and the blur. So watch all 4. They'll all 4 move together as I slide this towards the center. And if you notice as I'm doing that, the blur is coming in more towards the center of that focal point. So you can control the transition of how much is sharp and where the blur starts by moving these inner circles, okay? Now, let's just say they're not letting you achieve what you want with your image and you want to customize it more. Well, you can do that. So if you press Alt or Option, and keep it depressed and click on any one of those, you can move them in. So see now the other ones aren't moving. So if I want a little bit more of my steak, for instance, is sharpened, I can move that out and have the transition point to blur closer out. Same thing at this bottom circle down here. I'll left click in there with Alt or Option depressed and pull down so that we get a little bit more sharpness out to the edge with that steak. Same thing over here on the right. I'll Option Alt and pull that out. And then this one, the Alt Option, I think I'll actually pull it in a little bit so it's more just on the steak. Okay, so you have the flexibility of either pulling them without pressing Alt and Option and having them all move together, or you can Alt Option and selectively move any or all of them selectively on their own. Then we move out to this pink bounding box, which has these little tiny dots or circles on it. And if you'll notice, when I pull just outside of those, there's a 2-headed arrow and it's bent. So that's a symbol for rotation. So my steak is sort of rotating this direction. So I want to rotate the focus area so that it's a little more rotated with my steak. And then also we'll include the tip of the knife that's here. Now, if you noticed, as I was rotating, it also was able to collapse in a little bit. So you can adjust how wide or narrow it is with the sharpness area with those little dots. You also can hover with the two-headed arrow that is not curved on the pink, over the pink line, and just pull in if you want it to be a little tighter as to where your sharpness area is that way too. So now we have adjusted the transition area, how far out we want the blur to either come in or go out. And with this little dial, we've adjusted how much blur we want. And I think we can get pretty aggressive with the blur because it'll still be clear what's there in the image, but it just won't get distracting from this stake. And let me move this out just a little bit there and move this in just a little bit here. Now, if you've noticed when I've been hovering, so let me come out into a cleaner area here. When I have this sitting here like this, can look at the center of my highlighter here, right down at the lower right, and you'll see there's a push pin kind of a symbol with a plus. What that means is you can add more selective focus points to your image by clicking with that. So as I said up front, I was wanting to get some of these vegetables that are more in the foreground here in focus too, just for context, so it's clear to somebody what else is on the plate without having to see a lot of the same thing. So I'm going to use that little sharpening push pin and just click it right about there. And now you can see that it has sharpened this whole area up in my image. So same thing. We have the active focus point, and you know it's active because now that one has the pink dot in the center. Notice this no longer has the pink dot. And we can adjust how much the blur is surrounding that. We can adjust these little inner circles by pulling them in or out for the transition for the blur. And I want to keep this pretty focused out till pretty close to the edge. We can pull in the edges with the pink circle, and we can also adjust using these tiny circles, the rotation and whether it's further out or further in. Now, one other thing that I haven't pointed out that's also on this sort of radius of sharpness, if you want to call it that, or perimeter of sharpness, is there's also a little square box right here. Now, if you click on that and pull out, see, it's squaring off, so you can go from a circle to a square. So if you have something like I do that maybe it's better with a squared off edge here, then that's something that you can adjust and make your image a little bit more squared off. So now we have two areas, selective areas of focus, with the rest surrounded by blur. Now, let's just say that you have decided that you maybe think you want to have the glass in focus too. So you take your little pin symbol and you click it over there. And then you say, oh no, that's too distracting, you know, and then again, depending on what you're working with is your image, but you might put a focus pin in and then decide, no, that's not going to work. So to get rid of it, all you have to do is click the backspace or the delete key, and that will get rid of that. Okay. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here is, and right above where we are, is if we look here in the options bar right at the top of the interface, we have, first of all, I have it set to preview, so you probably want yours clicked on to preview so you can see what's happening with this. I usually like to click mine to high quality so I can see what it's going to really look like. And then the other thing I often like to do, especially since I typically will do further post-processing after I add the blur to my image, is save mask to channels, and I click that on. So that way I am creating a mask that I can use when I'm back in my layer stack without having to re-mask these areas that I sharpened, okay? So, and essentially you're getting the mask of the blur areas when you're doing that, but of course you can always invert it and work with, so if you wanted to actually darken this area, then you could invert it and do that too. Okay, so now we have our selective focus areas. We've adjusted the amount of blur that's surrounding those focus areas. We have the type of quality and the mask setup if you do want to have a mask with one of the focal dots highlighted and active, then we can come back over to this right settings panel, and there's some other tools down below here that we can work with. So in this tab, we have the effects of being able to add light bokeh. So if you want to slide that along, see what's here, let me see if I can, you can adjust the light range here and how much is going to be affected, and then you pull, so those little handles under the light range will tell you how much of the image can be looked at to create the light bokeh. And then you can pull, so I'll just be very dramatic so you can see where that's happening, and I don't want it to be that dark, but that bright rather. But I might add a little bit just for a little bit of effect. So that's purely optional if you want to add some bokeh effects, light effects to your image. Motion effects will not be relevant in iris blur, but you also can add noise. So if you click on the noise tab, you have the flexibility of different types of noise you can add. So you can add grain, you can add a more evenly distributed uniform noise, or you can add a more speckly type of Gaussian noise. So I'm personally going to maybe select uniform because I think it just adds a little interest to have some light noise in an image for a couple of reasons. One is if you over denoise, it can end up looking very plastic. And secondly, noise, a little bit of noise in the shadows actually adds some better adds some better details to the shadows. So it helps to enhance, is what I wanted to say, the details in the shadows. So if I pull this way up, you'll see how much noise. So this is the amount of noise that you're adding. So you can see you can get very aggressive with it. And I only want to add a very little bit to mine. Also, I don't want to adjust or have it impact the colors in my image or use any color noise, so I'm going to leave mine at 0. So that, for me, is where I want to leave this. So once you get all your settings the way you want, you come up to the top of the interface and click on the OK button to accept it. And then we're back into the Photoshop layer stack and Photoshop interface again. And as you can see, now we've added to that layer. Because that smart object was there, we now have a mask that you could work with that would be usable with smart filters. And we also have a new sub-layer called Blur Gallery, because that's what we were working with the iris blur, was the Blur Gallery. Now, if you look at this and say, you know, the more I look at it, I wish I had blurred it more or less or whatever for your particular image. Well, that's the benefit of using that smart object. You can double click where it says Blur Gallery, and it takes us right back into this interface again for the iris blur. And let's say I changed my mind and I wanted to make this a little blurrier than I actually had made it before. Once you get your adjustments made to how you want it, whether it's the blur or the effects or the noise, then click OK again up at the top of the interface, and the revisions that you made will be applied to the layer. So now we have achieved what I said that we were trying to do, which is selective focus in this area here of the image, surrounded by a very soft blur with a quick fall off. So again, that's, to me, the kinds of effects that you can achieve with a lens baby type of a lens. All right, so now we have added those other features. I mentioned when we were in the iris blur interface that you could set it up to create a mask that you could reuse, or a channel that you could reuse as a mask. So if we slide right across to the channels panel here and look, here we have the mask that was created. Let me click on that. So you can see these were the areas that I chose to be sharp. And because we were working with a blur tool, it is showing the areas of blur on this mask and hiding the areas that are sharp. So if you want to either darken the background some more, for instance, with an exposure or a brightness setting, you could use this as a mask. And then you've already got your mask made for the areas that, with the blur area, that maybe you want to darken down and put even more emphasis onto your sharp areas. So it's just something you can work with as an extra convenience if you don't want to have to start recreating masks again. So to show you where we started, was that full plate of food and everything going on in the background. And then what we have achieved, let me label it here, so you have it for reference with the iris blur in the blur gallery. So we have that sweet spot surrounded by the very soft blur. So I hope that's been helpful to you, and maybe you learned something new about a new tool that you can experiment with. As usual, if you would be interested, if you are not already subscribing to my channel and would like to subscribe and have YouTube notify you with a single notification when I do post new content, then please click on the subscribe button below the video. If you've subscribed in a former video of mine, you do not need to do it again. You're all set. Anyway, I hope you have fun working with and experimenting with selective focus and using the iris blur tool in Photoshop.